Hey guys, tonight we climb aboard a creaky wooden ship, its sails swollen with wind, its timbers groaning as if in protest of yet another voyage across the open sea. You feel the ocean spray on your face, but not in a refreshing beach vacation kind of way, more like a salty slap from Poseidon himself. The sky is gray, the sea is darker, and below deck, well, let's just say it doesn't smell like cinnamon and fresh laundry. I love seeing how far these sleepy ships can sail. Instead, it smells of old rope, wet boots, unwashed men, and something suspiciously sour. Yes, that's our star for tonight. Pickled cabbage. Barrels of it stacked neatly next to the rum and gunpowder, like they belong there. You probably wouldn't survive this voyage, to be honest. Not with your modern stomach, accustomed to almond milk lattes and refrigerated leftovers. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. This is what pirate life really smelled like. Not gunpowder and gold, but salt, sweat, and cabbage. You lean closer to one of the barrels. The lid has been pried open just a crack. A thin layer of white yeast film clings to the surface like a delicate moldy snow. Charming. You're not sure if you're hungry or horrified. And while you're at it, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is there. Better than your toes falling off, he mutters. Now dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Imagine someone in the British Admiralty carefully drawing up a shipment list. Cannonballs, musket powder, and sauerkraut. But in this world, a barrel like that could mean the difference between life and death. Between walking upright and crumpling into a bruised mess of bleeding gums and twisted limbs. Not exactly the image you associate with high seas adventure, but far more realistic than buried treasure in parrots, sometimes even guarded. You imagine a petty theft trial, sailor caught red-handed with a spoonful of cabbage sentenced to mop duty for a week. Justice at sea was rarely subtle. Let others chase glory and gold, you wise traveler, have found the true treasure. The sailors didn't fully understand what caused it not yet, but they knew enough to connect pickled cabbage with not dying horribly. You duck your head as you descend into the belly of the ship, wooden steps slick with brine, air thick with sweat and smoke. Lanterns sway. A sailor snores. Another curses softly while playing dice with a bone-carved cup. There are reports of pirate crews singing songs about their sour provisions, turning misery into melody, as sailors tend to do. Historians still argue whether pickled cabbage was consistently present on pirate ships, or if it was more common in naval and merchant fleets. But what's certain is this: when it was available, it was eaten with gusto. Often mixed with salt pork, sometimes just slurped down like a crunchy shot of health. You imagine a chorus of rough voices, off-key, swaying as the ship lurches. Oh, the brine she bites me nose-butt, keeps me guts and toes. Over in the corner, nestled in the shadows, are the barrels. Slimy and thick with green algae, unless you were lucky. Merchant ships, navy ships, whalers, privateers, all carrying the sharp, sour promise of another day lived with your teeth intact. But cabbage, when properly pickled, could last. It didn't need refrigeration. It didn't even need a lot of space. And when you're dealing with long voyages, weeks, sometimes months across sun-baked oceans, doesn't rot instantly is as good as gourmet. Thick oak barrels sealed tight, stamped with trademarks, smelling sharply of brine and rot and cabbage, not the leafy, crisp salad kind. No, this cabbage has been chopped, salted, stuffed into barrels, and left to ferment in its own juices. It is sour. It is funky. And it is unfortunately delicious if you haven't tasted anything fresh in 3 months. These ships weren't stocked with abundance. In fact, food was often the first thing to rot or run out. Meat, spoiled bread, moldy water. You stand there for a moment, just inhaling the sharp vinegar tang of survival. A shipmate walks by and pats the barrel with something close to affection, which unfortunately is not just a colorful saying. It's a nod to the specter haunting every voyage. Scurvy. That's why these barrels weren't an afterthought. They were deliberate, placed strategically among the rum and hardtack. And here's the thing, pickled cabbage wasn't just a side dish. It was part of the atmosphere, part of the culture. It's hard to tell where fact ends and sailor myth begins. And the pirates weren't alone. By the mid-18th century, pickled vegetables, especially cabbage, were making their way into European supply chains, thanks in part to rising awareness of long-haul scurvy. There's a certain poetry in that, isn't there? You reach out and tap the side of the barrel, half expecting it to reply. It doesn't. It's just a barrel. And so, with the ship creaking above and the waves lapping below, you sit beside the cabbage. You feel the sway of the ship beneath you, a lazy, hypnotic roll that might lull you to sleep if not for the sudden slap of canvas and the distant bark of orders from the quarterdeck. Above, sailors scurry across, rigging like frantic spiders. Below, the darkness hums with a quieter tension. Men cough, rats scurry, someone mutters a prayer. No fever. No bleeding out in a blaze of cannon smoke. Just falling apart from the inside out. In the 18th century, the common sailor wouldn't have known the word vitamin. All he knew was that on certain ships he stayed whole. Ancient texts hinted at citrus fruits. Vasco da Gama's crew learned the hard way in the 1490s. Indigenous cultures knew the power of fresh plants. Old sailors clung to their hardtack and salt beef like sacred relics. There were captains who'd rather face mutiny than change a ration plan. Historians still argue whether the resistance was due to ignorance, logistics, or plain old stubbornness. A disease born of deficiency. A cure buried in a barrel. And a crew of sea-hardened men, many of whom can barely read. Surviving not with swords and rum, but with the fermented leftovers of a German grandmother's kitchen. Even 17th century Dutch sailors experimented with greens and sauerkraut. But instead, men wasted away because no one believed in the healing powers of fresh produce. And if that doesn't sum up the human condition, nothing does. And on others, he began to rot. Someone, probably the quartermaster, or maybe a cook with a soft spot for fermenting things, has managed to stash enough pickled cabbage to give each crewman a scoop every few days. Not because they read the latest scientific paper, but because a cabbage barrel that didn't go slimy after 3 weeks was a godsend. It's not perfect, but it's something. And on the high seas, something can be the difference between seeing the next port. The ship creaks, as ships always do, like it's talking in its sleep. Is a spoonful of cabbage. Round you, the hum of the vessel continues. Snoring sailors, clanking chains, the rhythmic splash of the sea against wood. And beneath it all, the whisper of survival, pickled, preserved, patient, and being buried at sea. Wrapped in your hammock, cannonball tied to your feet, and you're still sitting near the cabbage barrel, nose half accustomed now to its vinegary tang. A few months without fresh food would reduce you to a trembling, toothless husk. Somewhere above, a sailor is singing off-key and half-hearted. The lyrics drift down through the planks. First came the fatigue, then swollen limbs, bruises from the lightest touch, gums that bulged like overripe fruit, and teeth that simply dropped out like loose nails. By the time you noticed something was wrong, your body was already waving the white flag. It seems absurd, really, that this odd-smelling vegetable is the ship's best hope against something as terrifying as scurvy, a disease so slow and sneaky. It made death seem like a favor by the end. Scurvy was the great betrayer of sailors. You could be the strongest man on the crew, something invisible yet essential. Vitamin C, though, they didn't call it that yet. A naval surgeon in 1747, he conducted what's now considered one of the first clinical trials. 12 men, 6 treatments. Only the citrus group recovered. But the Admiralty shelved the findings for decades. Historians still debate why. Some say budget, others say bureaucracy. Others barely limped into port, with only a few men still able to stand upright. Picture a ship crawling into a harbor, its sails torn, its decks eerily silent, its crew those still breathing too weak to drop anchor. That was scurvy's calling card. It took centuries for anyone to truly grasp what caused it. Some ships became floating graveyards. Entire crews were wiped out. The funny thing is, the solution had been floating around for ages like a message in a bottle no one bothered to read. But maritime tradition dies hard. So here you are, floating through a chapter of history where lives could be been saved by something as simple as a salad. Still, on this particular pirate ship, there's a glimmer of hope. As you nibble a few imaginary shreds of briny cabbage, you can't help but feel the absurd dignity of it all. You lean back against the hull, listening to the water slap lazily against the wood. Heave-ho! Me gums are sore, but cabbage keeps me off the floor. You chuckle softly. Tch. It's not exactly poetry, but it tells the truth. That sailor's song, silly as it sounds, captures what few understood at the time. Cabbage, especially fermented cabbage, held something vital. James Lindra, remember his name, was one of the first to test this in an official capacity. Meanwhile, pirates and privateers just kept doing what worked, some of them anyway. And so, the smell of brine and rot became a kind of strange comfort, a nasal reminder that you were, for now, still alive, still chewing, still whole. You stretch your legs and feel the boards beneath you shift. Your eyes drift shut for a moment, lulled by the sounds and the strangely soothing thought that all it takes to fend off death. You wake, or maybe you never really fell asleep to, the familiar scent of brine and sweat and old wood. Mingled with the not-so-subtle tang of pickled cabbage, the ship is quieter now. A few snores echo softly from hammocks, swaying like sleepy metronomes. And above, the occasional thump of a restless sailor on night watch thuds through the planks. It's a calm moment, which means it's the perfect time to talk about food. Really, it's just a crude cooking station squished near the center of the lower deck. A firebox enclosed in iron to keep the flames from licking the timbers. Soot on everything, okay? A pot that never fully cools. Here the cook is king if. The king smelled like boiled beef water and swore like a mule cart driver. Or rather, the lack of it. You trudge your way toward the galley, if you can call it that. To fermentation, tonight's meal, salt pork and hardtack. Again, water turned green. Bread sprouted fuzz. Meat oozed. Even beer could sour if not carefully stored. So, when you find something that doesn't spoil, you cling to it. You bite into the hardtack, well, you try. It's more like chewing a stone that once dreamed of being bread. Not to keep the food fresh, mind you, but to keep desperate hands away. Ships experimented with all kinds of fermentables. Carrots, onions, turnips. Anything that could be salted and sealed in a barrel had a chance of surviving the voyage. But cabbage had the edge. It fermented quickly. It'd crunch. It didn't need extra spices. The temps hits your nose first, then your tongue. Sharp, sour, deeply strange, but not unpleasant. There's a reason this stuff has survived for centuries, even if it's never quite cracked the fine dining menu. And, as it turns out, it packed enough vitamin C to keep your teeth in your head. Holding his own steaming bowl of stew, back home, he says, the wind groans through the sails. Somewhere above, a seagull cries. And down here in the belly of the ship, a dozen men are slurping their way through another bowl of sour salvation. In a world without refrigeration, without nutrition science, without even the certainty of landfall, a good barrel of pickled cabbage is worth its weight in gold, or at least worth sharing. Chewing thoughtfully, they'd feed this to pigs. Imagine a starving sailor sneaking into the magazine, risking an explosion just to score another bite of sauerkraut. And out here, showing off a mouth with more gaps than teeth, ain't that the truth? It's a delicacy. The galley might be grimy. The food might be questionable. But for tonight, it's warm. It's filling. It's not deadly. Pirates were bold, but cabbage bold. That's another level. But on 18th century ships, it took on a different meaning. Others argue the opposite. Without formal supply chains, pirates often fared worse, scraping the barrels faster, relying more heavily on whatever they could preserve. Either way, one thing's certain: when a ship did have pickled food, it was guarded like treasure. It became a life-saving science disguised as food preservation. Not that any of the pirates would have said it that way. They weren't exactly writing dissertations down in the galley, but they knew what worked, and they passed it on. Other times, it was simply salted and mashed into submission. Sailors sometimes spiced it up with mustard seeds or dried herbs, especially when they raided a well-stocked merchant vessel. On rare occasions, ships made cabbage stew, a kind of strange, sour soup that no land dweller would touch but which, to a pirate, tasted like home. The weevils are extra protein if you're lucky. That sharp tank slices through the greasy monotony of the meal like a blade. It doesn't just taste different, it feels different, lively, vibrant. Or maybe he, still haunted by that one voyage 3 years ago when the cabbage barrels went moldy halfway through the Atlantic crossing and the crew nearly turned on each other. You heard that story everyone has? The rats were eating better than the sailors by the end. And on a ship where everything else is slowly dying or decomposing, that matters. If you're really lucky, they're already dead. It's no wonder that when someone pulls out a small wooden bowl of something sour and stringy pickled cabbage, it becomes the culinary equivalent of fireworks. You watch the cook stir a slop of pork fat and cabbage together over a low flame, mumbling to himself in some forgotten dialect. He sprinkles in black pepper like he's solving a riddle, then slaps a ladle of it into a wooden bowl. 8. "Don't say I never loved ya," he mutters, handing it over. You raise the bowl in mock salute. He doesn't laugh. Maybe he's heard that joke too many times. That's the thing about sea travel in the 1700s. Nothing stayed fresh. Everything had the potential to kill you. Pickling wasn't new. It was ancient, really practiced by the Chinese, the Greeks, the Romans. Historians still argue whether pirates had more variety in their diets than naval crews. Some say yes, more freedom meant more looting, more fresh stock from raided ports. In some logs, those rare journals from literate crewmates, there are references to food rations being locked up with the powder kegs. And it wasn't just cabbage. Of course, not all cabbage was created equal. Some was finely shredded and fermented in brine sauerkraut style. You slurp another bite. A crewmate plops beside you. You nod. He grins. Outside, you stretch your legs and glance around. And that's a win. The next morning, though morning is a loose term, when the sky is the same color of wet wool all day, step out onto the deck with the wind tugging at your clothes and the faint smell of vinegar still clinging to your sleeves. The sun is little more than a smudge behind the clouds, and your stomach growls the moment the scent of something cooking wafts up from below. Something sour. At this point, it's basically part of your personality. Cabbage again. It's not the flashiest vegetable. It doesn't have the poetry of apples or the nobility of grain. This was the age of empire, when European powers were greedily carving up trade routes and colonizing coastlines like kids picking teams at recess. Every voyage carried not just cannons and muskets, but cargo. Spices, silk, rum, gold, and yes, food. And yet, here it is again, and again surviving, where men and empires stumble. But what's agreed upon is this. By the mid-1700s, cabbage had gone global. Not because of a great culinary revolution, but because it worked. Barrels of it showed up in Caribbean ports, at trading posts in India, and in the cold reaches of Nova Scotia. In the Americas, early settlers who braved the Atlantic crossings often carried cabbage starts with them. It's not the fermented kind, actual seeds, stuffed in pouches, planted in tiny hopeful rows as soon as the soil would let them. If you could grow cabbage, you could survive. If you could ferment it, you could thrive. British ships stocked it. French ships adapted it. Even the Russians, in their sprawling overland expansion, pickled everything that wasn't nailed down, including cabbage. Not because pirates were suddenly health conscious, but because they were practical. No cabbage meant lower odds of surviving the long haul. And pirates had every reason to stay alive. They had plunder to spend and grudges to settle, adjusting sails with the kind of mechanical ease that comes from months of repetition. One of them bites into a biscuit so hard it cracks in half. Another sneaks a bite of something from a cloth pouch. Stringy, probably cabbage. You're not complaining. Families pass down fermentation, crocks the way others pass down silverware. Dodged storms, survived revolutions, and watched empires rise and fall, all from the quiet safety of a wooden barrel. No medals, no songs, just quiet survival. A small, sour miracle in a world of hardship. The smell drawing you in like a sleepy homing pigeon. A fresh barrel has been tapped. Could keep them alive. The cook mutters something about the good stuff. Bad for something your modern fridge probably ignores until it turns purple and starts a coup in the crisper drawer. He ladles out a mix of pork drippings and cabbage, and suddenly it doesn't feel like ship rations anymore. It feels like something older, something shared. In Scandinavia, where winters lasted longer than most marriages, pickling was a necessity. Lawless, often, but stupid, rarely. If a ship they plundered had barrels of cabbage and the crew looked suspiciously not covered in scurvy bruises, that information spread faster than any cannonball, but also took half a dozen barrels of pickled cabbage hoisted aboard like precious treasure. A few months later, those pirates reportedly turned up in a Cuban port healthier than any crew seen in weeks. Locals gossiped that they must have discovered some kind of sea witchery. Turns out, It was just brined vegetables. You either learned to ferment vegetables, or you learned to enjoy starvation. As you lean over the rail, watching the endless waves roll by like an unwelcome guest that won't leave, you start to wonder, how did Cabbage, of all things, make it onto so many ships? They carried cultural habits, and Cabbage was one of them. To understand that, you have to go back not just to pirates and privateers, but to the imperial machines of the 18th century. Enter pickled cabbage. It was already a staple in many European countries. In Germany and Eastern Europe, sauerkraut wasn't just food, it was tradition. So when ships left Port B, they merchant naval, or privateer, they carried with them more than letters of marque and barrels of gunpowder. Historians still debate exactly when pickled cabbage first became widespread in naval rations. Some point to the Dutch as early adopters. Others give credit to the Germans. And nothing spreads like a good idea in the face of looming death. European powers began trading pickled cabbage as part of their supply strategies. It didn't take long for the colonists to catch on. There is a strange comfort in imagining that some settler family huddled in a tiny cabin while snow piles up outside, cracking open a jar of sauerkraut made from their fall harvest. You can see now why pirates might have taken note. They weren't fools after all. Romanticized? Sure. And so. Cabbage stowed away on even the most rebellious vessels. One account, possibly apocryphal, but delightful nonetheless, it's of a pirate ship that raided a Dutch merchant vessel. They stole spices, coins, and cloth. You shift your weight on the deck and glance over at the crew. They're swabbing, hoisting, and you can't help but think, Cabbage has seen things. It's crossed oceans, you head back below. A reminder that even on a lawless pirate ship in the middle of nowhere, a humble vegetable could bind men together, could keep them sane. You settle in next to one of the open barrels, spoon in hand, steam curling up from your bowl in lazy spirals. The ship sways gently, and your knees sway with it. You've gotten used to the rhythm. But what you're not used to, even now, is the realization that on this floating world of gunpowder and grog, pickled cabbage is considered medicine. And the surgeon here is more likely a former butcher, barber, or possibly just the last guy standing after the real surgeon was accidentally launched overboard. His hands are stained. His tools clink in a canvas roll like a murderous xylophone. He sniffs the contents, grunts in approval, and ladles a portion into a wooden bowl. Patient, he mutters, motioning to a gangly sailor sitting nearby, legs wrapped in bandages and teeth chattering like dice in a cup. Well, it leans toward, don't scream too loud. And the one in charge of this strange medical arsenal?
The surgeon.
Nestled among his knives and bone saws is a squat, iron-hooped cask of fermented cabbage, sealed and stamped with whatever trade company they looted it from. Overly poetic? Perhaps. But he wasn't wrong. He eyes the barrel you're leaning against and tuts quietly. That one's not for eating. That one's for healing. You nod solemnly, as if you weren't just planning to sneak a spoonful. This isn't food. This is a prescription. If you're imagining a stern man in crisp white, forget it. This isn't the Royal Navy. This is a pirate vessel. Because what is food on a ship like this, if not also medicine? What is survival, if not made of small, sour miracles? A few strands of pickled cabbage, carefully wrapped, cherished like a charm. When you're months from the nearest port, hundreds of miles from anything green, and surrounded by men who die for far less than a bad meal, a few strands of cabbage might be all the protection a man can find. A scoop there for the sick. A quiet nod to the captain, who, it's rumored, eats a spoonful every morning before shouting orders with that unnatural cheer. He says nothing, just nods at you and tucks it away again. But he has one prized possession, the surgeon's barrel. And somewhere, deep in the moldy crevices of maritime history, a footnote is forming a quiet acknowledgement that when all else fails, pickled vegetables might just save your life. You watch him open it with the care most men reserve for maps to buried treasure. But here, on the creaking edge of the known world, every bite counts. Every bite has a history, a cost, a whisper of survival. The sailor grimaces, but takes the bowl. Everyone does. Others argue that even the most ruthless captains quickly learned the cost of losing men to scurvy. Dead men can't man the sails, after all. The taste may be sharp, but the alternative bleeding gums, falling teeth, and joints that swell like rotten fruit is far worse. It's almost funny. Pirates who live by the sword and die by the musket ball are being saved by fermentation. No syringes, no beeping machines, just vinegar, time, and quiet desperation. Might live another week, he says, raising his bowl. Historians still argue whether this level of medical understanding was consistent across pirate crews. Some suggest that only the more enlightened ships prioritized diet. Without rigid naval protocol, they could improvise. Experiment. Treat with sauerkraut and citrus. Tease. And anything else that wouldn't tea-rot faster than a monkey on rum. And pirate surgeons, odd as they were, often proved to be some of the most forward-thinking members aboard. One recovered letter from a pirate surgeon, likely apocryphal, but it's too good not to imagine, describes Cabbage as a brine of life in a barrel of death. The surgeon passes by you now, wiping his hands on a stained cloth and muttering about supplies. And yet the lines blur. The sailor next to you shifts and pulls out a folded cloth from his shirt pocket. Inside it, superstition? Probably. But who are you to judge? It's easy to mock. It's easy to scoff from the comfort of history books and fresh groceries. And so the surgeon doles out his portions, a ladle here for the wounded. In a world with no hospitals, no antibiotics, and very little hope, this is how you stay alive. One ladle at a time. You lean back, arms folded, watching the slow ritual of healing unfold. And you know what? It works. The sailor beside you coughs, clears his throat, and flashes a crooked smile. You raise yours in return, to Cabbage. To Cabbage, he echoes, solemnly. Above gulls cry. Below barrels breathe. There's a saying passed around among the more literate members of the crew, those rare few who can read maps without pretending. A man who lives by the sword dies by the cabbage. Less he eats it. It gets a chuckle every time. But under the laughter, there's truth. It's more truth than most care to admit. And as you pull your coat tighter against the ocean wind, your eye catches the captain striding across the quarterdeck with unusual purpose. As the Enlightenment swept through Europe in powdered wigs and printing presses, even the rough world of seafaring began to shift. Not dramatically, mind you know. One was installing telescopes on the mast, but small things changed. Navigators relied more on math than instinct. Surgeons demanded cleaner instruments, and the smarter captains, they took notes. Unlike most pirate captains, who tend to lead by bravado, bellowing, or the occasional pistol whip, this one is calm. The survivors made it to port on rice, water, and regret. Was it Enlightenment thinking that made them feed their crews cabbage? Or was it desperation wrapped in a thin layer of rational thought? But he noticed something curious. The men who nibbled on the sour cabbage, rationed for the officers, stayed on their feet longer. He remembered that. Curiosity piqued. He stops at the supply hold, keys jangling on a brass ring. Unlocks a heavy wooden hatch. Inside, not gold. The same kind of pride a baker might have over sourdough starters. You half expect someone to name a barrel, and yet kinda beautiful. Old Bertha's got the best bite. You feel it again, that odd mix of chaos and order. A world stitched together not by kings or crowns, but by clever men with brine and barrels. Someone murmurs nearby, "It's not gunpowder." The vinegar bites your tongue, but you don't mind. You understand now? This isn't just food, it's philosophy. Just rows of neatly stacked barrels, each marked with a date, a trade port, and the letters PC Pickled Cabbage. On ships like this, taps one gently. This is my real treasure. It doesn't, but you can see it in his eyes. Nods in approval. And unbruised limbs, that's no small feat. He doesn't need to rule by fear. He rules by function. His crew stays loyal, not just because of loot, but because they can still chew their meals without spitting teeth. Cabbage became more than food. It was policy. When he finally got his own commanda, scrappy schooner with patched sails and a crew of misfits, he made one unusual decree. Thoughtful. He carries a small book tucked under one arm and in his other hand. They're curing still. You want the middle stacked batch from Barbados? Fermented nice and slow. A slice of pickled cabbage, dangling casually between his fingers like a cigar. This is the man who, according to ship gossip, believes in science. This ship? Men disembarked upright, cursing, laughing, ready to drink the nearest tavern dry. And news like that travels. He's not the first. But out here, it's fermented cabbage that's keeping the age of piracy afloat. Find a quiet spot and let the Thames of the cabbage mix with the salt of the sea. You wonder how many of history's great moments, battles, discoveries, revolutions hinged quietly on something as humble as a preserved vegetable. This captain, you learn, once served aboard a merchant vessel that fell ill halfway to the Indies. Half the crew died. Every man gets cabbage. At first the crew resisted. Tradition dies hard on the sea. Men wanted rum and meat, not vegetables that smelled like old socks soaked in vinegar. Slowly, week by week, voyage by voyage, the results became impossible to ignore. Other ships limped into port with crews barely able to climb down the gangplanks. Historians still argue whether such captains were true believers in science or just men with good instincts. But the result was the same. You follow the captain below deck now. He inspects the lids. You half expect him to turn and say, "The thing about this cabbage isn't just that it keeps the men healthy, it gives them control." When a captain can promise his men steady food, clear skin, and in the cutthroat world of piracy at dinner, you overhear the quartermaster explaining to a new recruit how the barrels are rotated. "Don't touch the front row," he warns. There's pride in his voice. It's absurd. You take your bowl. The age of reason may have changed the world, and in the flickering lantern light, as the ship rocks and the crew eats in companionable silence, and maybe this captain isn't the only one who's on to something. You swirl the last strands of cabbage in your bowl. Eat your cabbage, stay alive. Yeah. Not exactly the Enlightenment motto, but it works. The next day dawns with a rattle in the rigging and a fresh shiver in the wind. Storms, maybe, or just the ocean's way of reminding everyone who's in charge. You make your way to the main deck, your boots thudding against damp planks, and spot something unusual. A French merchant vessel in the distance, small, sleek, and trailing an oddly sweet scent through the breeze. Not powder smoke, not sweat, something tart. And it wasn't tea, just the perfume they snuck on board or the wine they tucked into cargo. It was The cabbage. The captain lifts his spyglass. French, he says, as if that explains everything. Maybe it does. Whereas the British clung to dried peas and salt beef with a vice-like grip, the French began leaning into fermented vegetables, pickled onions, carrots, and yes, cabbage. Some accounts say they even tossed in herbs like thyme and bay leaf, not just for taste, but because they believed it stimulated the humors. But there's little doubt, when it came to food, French ships smelled nicer. Because, as it turns out, French ships smelled different. French ships, particularly during the early 18th century, had developed their own approach to maritime nutrition. And the world's oceans became ever more crowded with trade and warships. Ports started drifting in, French crews lasting longer, and pirate ships, free from the politics of empire, adapted even faster. After all, pirates didn't care where the cabbage came from. They just cared that it worked. Fewer cases of scurvy. It's more discipline. It's all traced absurdly enough back to what they were eating. It's not Versailles, but it's not bad. French ships, especially those funded by more refined merchants or semi-official naval operations, often prioritized rations in ways that scandalized their more austere English counterparts. They believed in pleasure at sea within limits. A well-fed man fought better, a man who didn't have scurvy, even better still. Serve it with duck fat, if you're lucky. He pauses. Got it once in Martinique. Thought I died and floated to heaven. There's something about sea life that makes every small pleasure sacred, but something lingers. A question, maybe. A hot meal. A dry blanket. A bowl of pickled vegetables that doesn't taste like foot. Others suggest their aristocratic obsession with flavor trickled downward. Still others chalk it up to luck. You glance at your own bowl of cabbage, currently devoid of time or culinary elegance, and sigh. The French always had to make it complicated. Your grimaces and says foreign. Not necessarily better, but not worse either. And maybe, just maybe, this is how it happens. How cultures blend, even in the unlikeliest places, through barrels and brine. We French now. Cook is experimenting now, throwing in a bit of dried rosemary he found in the captain's quarters. It's a strange addition. Smells a little like soap. Tastes like something from land, but it's different, and that's enough. You could smell where a ship came from before you ever saw its flag, and in the chaos of empire and piracy, that mattered. But the difference went beyond flavor. Historians still debate whether this culinary flair led to actual improvements in sailor health, or whether it just made the slow death by disease slightly more delicious. Why did the French lean into herbs and vinegar while others clung to moldy bread? Was it science? Superstition? Simple taste? Aboard a pirate ship that smells slightly more elegant than it did yesterday, the wind still howls, the sails still snap, the deck still groans. But beneath it all, there's a new scent rising from the galley. You imagine climbing aboard one now warm bread instead of hardtack. Vinegar-glazed cabbage instead of plain sauerkraut. A cook who wipes his hands instead of scratching himself with a ladle. And the British took note. In the later part of the century, as naval conflicts increased, this triggered a slow, reluctant shift. British naval doctors began pushing for pickled rations. German sauerkraut became popular across borders, so when the French ship sails a little closer and the scent wafts over again, your cook raises an eyebrow. Smells like they got fennel in there, he mutters, only half disgusted. Fancy bastards, but you can tell he's taking mental notes. One of the officers, a wiry man with a scar down his chin, lines over to you. You ever tasted chokerout? Did you shake your head? French sauerkraut. They boil it in wine. You both go quiet for a moment, letting the idea of duck fat and cabbage swirl in the salt-thick air. The French ship veers off, uninterested in the likes of you, and the scent disappears as quickly as it came. Why did some cultures embrace food as medicine earlier than others? Historians still argue over it. Some claim the French had better agricultural networks. But you know this much. Food wasn't just survival, it was identity. Down in the galley, a younger sailor bites into a piece. Only in smell the cook shoots back. You smile as you chew. The taste is bold. So here you are. Hope and cabbage. Evening again, and the sea has calmed. The ship glides rather than groans. Overhead, stars appear one by one, not so much blinking into existence as slowly pushing their way through a sheer veil of cloud. You lean against the railing, breathing in the damp air, and there it is again, that scent. Briny, sour, strangely comforting, cabbage. But tonight, the story brewing below decks isn't about food or health or even survival. It's about ritual. Because something happens when you eat the same thing every day. When you stand in the same line with the same bowl and wait your turn beside the same hunched silhouettes, the act of eating becomes more than nourishment, it becomes habit, and habit becomes ceremony. You descend into the lower deck, where lanterns flicker with a sleepy orange light. The cook is already ladling out helpings. There's no fanfare, no barking orders. Storms could arrive without warning. Naval ships could appear on the horizon with loaded cannons. A simple tear in the sail could send a voyage veering wildly off course. But the cabbage, it's always there. Warm, tangy, unchanged. Just a quiet, steady rhythm. Scoop, pour, pass. Scoop, pour, pass. You fall into line without thinking. Everyone does. When even the most hardened sea dogs take a breath, sit down, and simply eat. This is the cabbage hour, moment in the day when the noise subsides. When no one's swinging from ropes or swabbing anything, he's missing 2 fingers on his left hand and once claimed to have survived a duel by biting someone's ear clean, although no one can confirm it. He stares into his bowl like it holds the secrets of the universe. And this ritual, oddly enough, has become one of the few stable things in a life otherwise filled with uncertainty. You sit across from a man they call Al, because he never blinks. You ever think, he says, we're just meat sacks with vinegar inside? You blink? You mean metaphorically? He shrugs. Or literally? Maybe that's why it works. Maybe the cabbage just speaks the same language as our insides. You don't have a reply to that. But as you take another bite, you wonder if he's not entirely wrong. Fermentation, after all, is life happening in slow motion. A kind of decay that becomes transformation. Much like sailing, much like aging, you head out fresh and crisp-handed. Come back, well pickled. And it's not just Owl getting philosophical. There's a quiet reverence among the crew now. Some say their nightly bowl with a splash of rum on the side helps them sleep. Others swear it keeps dreams away, particularly the bad ones. One grizzled sailor wears a cabbage leaf in his hat for luck. Another claims to have seen a ghost vanish the moment he spooned the last bit from his bowl. Some academics insist their world was one of pure violence and opportunism. A thin wisp of steam curls up from the pot. It'll be left there overnight, cooling slowly, only to be stirred again in the morning. The cabbage never leaves the pot. Just simmers gently, day after day, absorbing the flavor of salt and smoke and time itself. The cabbage doesn't just sustain you. It marks the hours like a briny pendulum swinging quietly in the belly of the ship. Others point to the songs, the symbols, the rituals like this one as proof that even the wildest crews built their own little systems of meaning. No one rushes. No one complains. For a few minutes, they're not pirates, not killers, not ghosts in waiting. They're just people, united by a shared craving and a shared comfort. Of course, it's nonsense. But you've learned something out here on the sea. Nonsense is often the best medicine. Historians still argue whether pirates had any true culture, or just an improvised survival code. And cabbage hour, it might be the closest thing the ship has to religion. There's a kind of worship in the way men clean their bowls, scrape the last bits with a crust of stale biscuit, and linger at the table. It's quiet now. The cook is slumped back against a crate, arms folded, satisfied with the evening's work. You stand and stretch. Your belly's full. Your thoughts are drifting. And as you make your way back to your hammock, you realize something strange. And in a life without clocks, without calendars, without clear destination, that rhythm is everything. Morning again, though you can't really tell, except for the subtle shift in voices gruffer, grumpier, still clawing their way out of sleep. The sun isn't visible, but the sky is brighter in that we survived another night sort of way. You already know what it wants. You swing out of your hammock and land with a soft thud, boots hitting wood that's already slick with seawater and salt. Your stomach grumbles familiar, faithful, cabbage. At the galley, the cook is already up, clanging ladles like church bells, stirring the pot that never truly cools. But not just for the taste, not even just for the health. Today, you realize cabbage is currency. Make your way below deck, stepping over a sprawled sailor who must have lost an arm wrestling match with a barrel of rum. The cook grunts, considers, and finally ladles out a heaping scoop of the good stuff. The kid grins like he's won a treasure map, he asks, voice cracking like a storm sail. A young Deck, hand barely old enough to grow sideburns, is standing nervously beside him, holding a small pouch. Trade, he made it halfway. The cook didn't even ask for repayment, just smirked and stirred the pot. There's Owl, still wide-eyed. The silent Norwegian who never speaks unless it's about sales. And the quartermaster, who chews like each bite is a tiny contract being signed. The cook raises an eyebrow. What you got? The boy opens the pouch, side 2 silver buttons, a lump of sugar, and something wrapped in cloth, probably stolen tobacco. Once, famously, a full bowl was traded for a carved ivory die said to be made from a monk's tooth, which is either a bold lie or a very strange career pivot for that monk. The thing both sides want enough to stay civil at least until the spoon scrapes the bottom of the bowl. Pickled cabbage isn't just keeping the crew alive, it's creating a quiet economy, system of give and take in a world where formal money means nothing. Just bowls and bellies and 1,000 whispered trades. It's on a ship like this, barter is survival. And in that system, pickled cabbage has quietly become one of the most valuable things aboard. You've seen it before. A man with a stash of cabbage can trade for an extra blanket, for a favor during sail duty, for protection in a fight. Got a spoon to spare? He asks. I'll sharpen your knife. Swear on my life. A half portion changes hands. Food has always been currency at sea, especially anything remotely fresh. Lemons, oranges, dried meats. But those don't last. Cabbage, on the other hand, is consistent. And consistency is a rare and beautiful thing when you're redrifting across an ocean with no promises. Historians still debate how often pirate ships functioned as miniature economies. Some say they were wild and lawless, living off impulse and violence. But others, those who study the logs, the inventories, the scribbled contracts between crew, paint a more complex picture. Ships as floating markets. Everything from rum to cabbage had a price. On this vessel, you've seen entire negotiations revolve around cabbage. One crew member, a tall man with a voice like a cracked bell, once bet 3 rations of cabbage that he could climb to the crow's nest blindfolded. You take your portion modest today and sit beside the same men you eat with every day? You spoon cabbage into your mouth slowly, savoring the sting. It's not the flavor, it's the familiarity. And it makes you wonder, is this how civilization begins? Not with laws, not with rulers, but with trade. With something useful, something needed. Even now, the cabin boy is working the room. The men grumble, but one of them relents. You think about that. One vegetable, grown in dirt, chopped and salted, transformed into a kind of silent power. No coins, no ledgers. You finish your meal and hand your empty bowl back to the cook. Thanks, you say. He nods. Same time tomorrow. And you know he's not just being polite. He means it like a banker would mean it, like a merchant closing up shop for the night. Tomorrow the pot will boil again, the deals will resume, the cabbage will flow. And somewhere in the briny swirl, this ship will keep moving, powered not just by sails, or wind, or greed, but by a quiet little system that somehow holds it all together. A barter economy afloat on vinegar. That afternoon the ship lists lazily to one side as the wind dies. The sails flap with a tired sigh, and the crew moves slower than usual, partly from the heat, partly from the sheer weariness of open water, with no land in sight. Somewhere nearby, someone's humming a sea shanty about goats and heartbreak. It's that kind of day. A calm sea is usually a blessing, but after days without direction, it starts to feel like floating through syrup. You settle beneath a patch of shade cast by a coil of rope, fanning yourself with a folded scrap of parchment someone scribbled lyrics on, like something no sensible person would ever put in the ship's log. Morale low. Administer cabbage. But here, bobbing across the nothingness, you've seen it happen. And in the stillness, your thoughts drift not to storms or treasure, but to something more peculiar. Men joke, they lean in, and for a few moments the edge disappears. Morale. It sounds absurd. After a long day, when tempers are fraying and patience is thinner than the deck planks, the moment that pot lid comes off and the vinegary scent rises like some ancient sea spirit, things soften. It doesn't matter if you read the quartermaster or the new recruits still calling the sails ropes. You get the same bowl, the same brine, the same bite. You see it in the way men swap stories over their bowls. They argue about the best ports, the worst storms, the ugliest tattoos. In a world of cannon fire and storm-tossed nights, this little act eating cabbage together becomes a reminder of something gentler, something shared. One night, someone even recited a poem about pickling. It didn't rhyme. It didn't scan. But it made everyone laugh until their stomachs hurt more than the vinegar. The cook ladles out helpings with the same solemnity as a priest distributing communion. Nothing breeds resentment faster than watching someone else eat better than you, especially when you're stuck on the same floating coffin. He doesn't notice you at first, just hums to himself, watching the cabbage swirl in its brine like it's telling him secrets. But records on the occasional surviving charter suggest that many captains valued harmony. Crews that trusted each other fought better, sailed faster, and mutinied less. It's about small, steady comforts. Things that say, you matter, you're fed, you belong. No one cuts in line. No one swipes extra well. Not often. It's an unspoken understanding. This meal is earned, not stolen. It's not because there's nothing to say, but because for now, everything's okay. It's not just a tradition. It's a reset button. It's a symbol of their strange, floating society, part prison, part sanctuary, part family. One sailor once described it like this: every bowl is a reminder we're still alive. Still us. Historians still argue how much pirate captains understood about morale. Some view them as tyrants, ruling with iron fists and floggings. It's not stolen gold or marked maps. It's not part of the captain's cut. It doesn't glitter or weigh heavy in the hand. And food was central to that harmony. In fact, some captains even had written codes requiring equal rations for all Minnow, matter their rank. That wasn't just fairness, it was strategy. So, the cabbage gets portioned out evenly. And the result? Unity. You hear it in the banter, playful, not cruel. There's something deeply human about it all. One night, you wake up in the dark and find the cook still awake, crouched by the pot stirring softly. Why cabbage, you ask. He shrugs. Because it works, and because it's ours. He doesn't elaborate. He doesn't have to. The cabbage belongs to no nation, no crown, no chartered company, but it's theirs, the crews, the ships. And you start to realize morale isn't about grand speeches or heroics. That night, with the wind returning in soft exhalations and the sea sighing beneath the hull, the crew eats together in silence. Tomorrow, they might face cannon fire, a split mast, a shipwreck, or worse land. But tonight, they have cabbage. Cabbage, it turns out, is enough. The next time you wake, it's two shouting, sharp and distant. Not the panicked cries of battle, but something closer to excitement. You swing out of your hammock, boots slapping against the cold boards, and scramble up the ladder to the main deck. Land. It's a smudge on the horizon. It's barely more than a charcoal streak beneath the cloud line, but it's unmistakable. Someone spots it, then someone else. Then the cry passes from man to man, until even the grumpiest sailor is squinting into the distance, cheeks split with smiles. But curiously, it doesn't mean the end of the cabbage. Landfall means many things: rest, repairs, fresh water, and a break from ship's rations. As the anchor drops and the crew prepares to go ashore in waves, you notice something peculiar. One of the officers is carrying 2 small barrels onto the longboat. Never know what local stool do to your innards? Those are ours, the cook mutters proudly. Don't want the shore food messing up our guts. You blink. They're taking cabbage with them. I fermented long enough to be safe and familiar. But there's a tavern, there's firewood, and there are vendors. And he's right. In the 18th century, landing in a port didn't guarantee a culinary paradise, 'cause while other men chase women or wine, He's chasing the one thing that matters most, more cabbage. And off to one side, barely tended, sits a small crate of what might be cabbager, a cousin of it. Wilted, slightly purple, slightly unpickled. She laughs, gestures to her own jar of something pungent. The old brine is drained carefully into a pot. Never waste the mother. The cook warns, and chopped vegetables are packed with salt and a dash of the local spice. Something warm, almost citrusy. They trade pickling tips like old friends, even without a common language. Vinegar, it seems, is universally understood. In fact, many pirates preferred to stick to what they knew.
Nice.
There's reverence now, an awareness that cabbage is not just a convenience, it's a companion. Land, food, unfamiliar spices, or improperly stored meat could knock a man down faster than a bullet. A new chapter in the cabbage saga. You feel oddly honored to have witnessed its birth. A barrel of old cabbage is strangely, it was the safer bet. Historians still argue whether pirates brought food ashore to avoid illness or to maintain morale. But either way, the cabbage goes with them. To our stinking savior, he says, slurring but sincere. Kept my teeth in my mouth and my guts in me belly. You picture it like a sacred relic, riding in the middle of the rowboat, while men with pistols and scars paddle like monks in a river procession. The port you've landed near is little more than a sprawl of dusty buildings, tangled fishing nets and goats that act like they own the place. As you disembark and walk into the market area, you see it. Stalls of salted fish, stacked plantains, and mounds of colorful local produce. The cook inspects it, sniffs, shakes his head. Won't last 3 days. So instead, he barters for salt, vinegar, and a clay crock. You follow him as he talks with a local woman about fermentation methods. Later, back aboard ship, a new barrel is already being prepared. This new batch will take time, of course. Weeks, maybe. But the process has begun. Meanwhile, the existing supply is rationed carefully. No one eats more than they're allowed. One sailor, drunk and barefoot on the dock, raises a toast to the barrel as it's carried back on board. You can't help but laugh, 'cause it's true. And in that moment, as the ship rocks gently against the pier, the scent of spiced brine mingling with salt and wood smoke, you understand something you hadn't before? This isn't just a pirate ship with a barrel of pickled cabbage. This is a pickled cabbage ship with some pirates on board. The days after landfall pass in a slow, dreamlike rhythm. The ship takes on supplies. The crew staggers back from shore leave in varying degrees of disgrace. Someone gets a new tattoo. Someone else loses a boot. But through it all, the cabbage remains unshaken, undiminished, the quiet constant at the heart of this drifting chaos. You're beginning to think of it less as food and more as a living part of the crew. The cook certainly treats it that way. Checks the barrels like a worried father inspecting his child's fever. He taps the sides. He listens for bubbles. He mutters to the brine, sometimes in encouragement, sometimes in warning. We've got a long sail ahead. Don't bloat on me now, he whispers to one batch, tightening the lid. No ports, no trading stops. Just water, wind, and time. For weeks. The weather turns strange, still humid, almost too quiet. There's a tension in the air that has nothing to do with mutiny or madness. They grimace at the taste at first. But by the end of the week, they come to the pot without being called. It's the deep discomfort of long journeys. Too many bodies in too little space. Too many hours with nothing to do but think. Some argue it was the alcohol that kept them sedated. Others point to the strict codes and shared profits. But perhaps in the end, it was the small, boring, things routine, repetition, meals that showed up at the same time every day without fail. This is the part of the voyage most men dread, the open sea crossing. His hands are calloused from years of rope and rain. His eyes flick to the horizon, then back to you. And it's here, more than anywhere else, that cabbage becomes not just a meal, but a measure of sanity. Out here, we eat what we have. But funny thing is, after a while, you stop minding. In knowing that when the bell rings, the pot will open, and inside will be something familiar. Not glamorous, not exciting, stable. You start to notice the shift on the fourth day out. Some men whittle, others sing. One tries to teach a parrot to swear in 3 languages. But when the hour comes to eat, when the cabbage barrels are unsealed, and that sour scent rolls across the deck, something changes. The crew anchors itself, not to the sea, not in a bad way. More like it can't go empty. Every time someone scoops the last serving, another inch appears at the bottom, steaming gently like it's been waiting, not to the sails, but to ritual. Spoon, scoop, chew, sigh. It's the same every time. A little vinegar to cut the silence. You find yourself watching the new recruits, now the youngest, greenest men, still unsure how to wrap their hammocks or climb the rigging without tangling themselves. Because cabbage, for all its sharpness, gives shape to the days. The crew taps it for luck. Some whisper to it when no one's looking. One even left a carved charm at its base, a tiny wooden spoon with a toothpick cross tied to it. Historians still debate how long pirate crews could endure these open crossings without tearing themselves apart. You talk to the helmsman one evening as he stares out over the black water. You start to think in circles of barrels that never empty, of storms that always return, of men who come and go, but cabbage that endures. You know what I miss most about land? He asks. You shake your head. Choice, he says. He pauses, then adds, sometimes I prefer not having to choose. You nod, understanding more than you expected. Because there's a kind of peace in knowing what's next. And on a ship full of chaos, stability is gold. There's a story going around the crew now, part joke, part legend, that one of the barrels is cursed. Of course, it's nonsense. But that doesn't stop them from assigning a name to it. Mother Barrel. No one laughs at him, not really, 'cause out here you start to believe in things you wouldn't on land. The ship creaks, the sea rolls, and the cabbage waits, same as always. You're halfway across the sea now. It's a point of no return behind you and the nearest shore somewhere far enough to be meaningless. The days blend into one another like waves rolling into the next, and the ship is quieter than usual. Not sullen, settled. And in this hush something new emerges. Cabbage superstition. It starts small, as these things always do. A sailor claims he saw lightning flash just as he opened a barrel and now insists that batch is cursed. Another swears the creak of the lid on one cask sounds like someone whispering his name. A third believes he dreamed of the cabbage speaking to him in an old sailor's tongue. Another believes you must never look directly into the pot before noon. It's bad luck, he says. We'll see things. You expect laughter, teasing, but none comes. Because deep down, everyone knows. When the sea is empty and the sky is too quiet, your brain starts looking for stories. One man insists the first scoop of cabbage each day must go to the youngest crew member, or the ship will drift off course. But to live on the sea is to live among unknowable forces, waves, tides, sickness. A well-timed breeze becomes a sign. A dream becomes a warning. And a particularly crunchy piece of cabbage, maybe that's a blessing. You may hoist sails, steer rudders, load cannons, but at the end of the day, you're just a speck drifting on a whim. Things, he shrugs. If it's cloudy, someone's about to fall overboard. If it smells too sharp, well, maybe the captain's lying about your next destination. Historians still argue whether pirate crews were deeply superstitious or just bored. And when you're a speck, it makes sense to assign meaning to the meaningless. The cook now refuses to stir the pot counterclockwise. It's not since Jonah's day, he mutters darkly, which makes no sense, but nobody questions it. Someone carves a tiny cabbage leaf into the masthead just beneath the skull and crossed swords. For balance, he says. There's talk of setting a fermentation shrine below deck. It's mostly a joke. Mostly. But even you start to feel it. The strange gravity these rituals create. It's a sense of rhythm, even in the absurd. Maybe especially in the absurd. Because this far from home, where the world narrows to wood, wind, and water, what else do you have but rituals? Your rain lashes the planks like whips, and the waves rear up as if angry about something you said. And in the soft hours before dawn, when the world is just a cradle of creaking boards and breath, you make your way down to the galley. The cabbage becomes a daily oracle. If the brine bubbles too fast, it means rough seas. Of course, none of it's real. And yet, it's one evening, as a red sun sinks beneath a violet sky, the cook pulls you aside. "Smell that?" he asks, lifting the lid. Do you lean in? It's different, spicier, a little too warm. He nods. Storm coming. You scoff, but 3 hours later, the clouds roll in. The sails snap to life. The deck becomes chaos. And over the roar of thunder, someone yells, "It was the cabbage." Mother Barrel knew. It shouldn't be funny, but you laugh anyway, 'cause of course the cabbage knew. Of course it did. Not to a captain. The storm passes, as all storms do. The sails are patched. The men sleep. The barrel sits there, untouched, waiting. You lift the lid. Steam rises. Familiar. Strange. Sacred. You scoop a small spoonful. Taste it. It's still warm. Still briny. Still the same strange alchemy of vinegar and survival. And maybe, just maybe, it is magic. Not the lightning bolt, shape-shifting kind, but the slow, patient, keep you'll live through madness kind. And in that moment, half asleep and soaked through, you whisper a quiet thanks. But to a guard, but to a barrel, to the cabbage, to the sea's quiet, crunchy prophet. You're close now. Not to land, there is none on the horizon, but to something. You feel it in the way the crew walks, slower but more purposeful. You hear it in the creak of the ship, as if the very wood knows its burden is almost fulfilled. The voyage is winding down, the great arc of this drifting journey curling toward its end. A new batch is already bubbling quietly below deck, tinged with island spice and stirred each morning by the cook's calloused hands. Just the first, the original. The one that tasted like home and vinegar and hope. But the crew treats the old cabbage like the final pages of a beloved book, reluctant to turn them, knowing once it's over, something changes. And so too is the cabbage. Then later, 1.5. And finally, on a gray morning with gulls overhead, he calls out, 1 full bowl. Not the idea of it that lives on, but the original barrels, the first blessed batch made before the voyage began. Those are finally running out. The standard story paints them as brutal and practical men who degut you for a doubloon and forget your name by sunset. But that story misses the strange tenderness that grew in the cracks of ship life. The friendships, the in-jokes, things shared so long they became sacred. It shouldn't matter. He kneels like the rest, scoops with a tin spoon, and nods. You're down to what's known now as the last barrel. Not the cursed one, not the lucky one. And each ladleful from it feels ceremonial. Then, too, men pass by the galley and glance at it like it's a shrine. Even the parrot stops squawking when it sees it. The cook announces it like a town crier. 2 scoops left. No one dares touch it. The bowl is empty. The pot is cleaned. The last barrel washed and turned over. It sits untouched for a day. Even the sails seem to sag with fatigue. But the Cabbage Eye's job is done. It got you through the doldrums, the storms, the long nights of ghost stories and bad jokes. The cook predictably refuses. It's just wood, he says. Let it rest. The cook brings the pot up to the deck, where it steams in the cool air. He places it in the center of the circle, steps back, and says nothing. Historians still debate whether pirate crews were sentimental. Not a meal. Moment. And nothing's been shared more than this cabbage. That evening, the crew gathers for what becomes an unspoken ritual. The final serving. One by one, each crewman steps forward and takes a single bite. Even the captain partakes, though he usually eats in private. Then he turns to the youngest among them, barely 15, all elbows and freckles, and hands him the final scoop. Yours, he says. The boy stares. I didn't do nothing to earn it. That's the point, says the captain. The cook claps once, and just like that, the moment's over. It's not sadness that follows. It's relief. The voyage has aged you all. Faces are more weathered. Voices rougher. And now it's time to let it go. There's talk of keeping the barrel as a memento. Some say to turn it into a drum. Others suggest carving names into it like a gravestone. But when no one's looking, you see him run a hand along the rim before storing it in the hold. That night, as stars prick the sky and the waves hush themselves to sleep, the ship sails forward. You think of all the things that sustained you. Wind, salt, laughter, and cabbage. Always cabbage. Tomorrow, the new batch will be ready. Different flavor, different mood, a new chapter. But tonight, you dream of brine. The sea is glass. Not calm in the usual sense, absolutely still. As if the world has stopped spinning, and the ship, for once, is allowed to float in peace. No creaking ropes. No barking orders. It's just the low murmur of a crew slowly realizing the voyage is, in every sense, nearly over. No storms. No sightings. No signs of land. Just silence and the final comfort of routine. The new cabbage batch is ready. It's not like the first one. Sharp, simple, bracing. This one has a whisper of spice, a flicker of heat at the back of your throat, like a ghost of something tropical. The color is slightly richer, the crunch a little gentler. But the soul is the same. It's just a tired grin and the familiar clang of ladle on tin. The men eat quietly, and no one dares say what they're all thinking. It still smells like safety. The cook serves it without ceremony. Others to the next ship, the next gamble. You don't know yet. And how they nod at each other, not in farewell, not yet, but in recognition. Some say they tore themselves apart over treasure. Others suggest they simply drifted apart, like threads loosed from a spool. One last voyage, one last shore, then nothing but stories. But the thought of not hearing the pop of the barrel lid, the sigh of steam, the vinegar that clears your nose and your thoughts that stings more than you expected. This might be our last bowl aboard. You rise, place your bowl with the others, and walk to the railing. There's been talk of parting ways of docking for good. Some will return to their families. You eat slowly, a spoonful of memory, a bite of something larger than food. Historians still argue whether pirate crews disbanded in moments of triumph or collapse. And this Cabbage is one of those stories now. You see it in the way men clean their bowls with that final crust of biscuit, and how they linger a moment longer before standing. You were here. You lived through it. You shared something. The murmurs of the crew fade into background music, distant, half-heard, and full of warmth. The wood beneath you groans, not with strain, but with age, like an old ship sighing into sleep. The ship's bell rings once, echoing across the water like a heartbeat. The sea stretches out before you, gold and endless. The sky above, painted in lavender and soft fire. And as you stand there, wind in your hair, salt on your tongue, you realize something peculiar. You don't remember every island, every storm, or every skirmish, but you remember every bowl, not because of what it tasted like, but because of who you were when you ate it. A dreamer, survivor, a pirate. A man with salt in his blood and vinegar in his soul. The wind hushes you. You breathe deep. And for a moment, everything is still. Wind down begins. The sails ripple gently, and the stars begin to show themselves, one by one, like old friends returning from a long journey. The water laps softly against the hull. You settle into your hammock one last time, cocooned in canvas and memories. And below deck in the galley, the barrel rests once more. Half full. Always half full. The scent lingers, faint but faithful, like a lullaby you don't quite remember the words to. You close your eyes. Not because you're tired, but because you can. Because for the first time in what feels like years, everything is quiet and safe and brined to perfection. The sea cradles you, and the cabbages, even the cabbage blesses you. Sweet dreams. All done. Thank you for sailing the seas of briny bedtime nonsense with me. Whenever you're ready for another odd, soothing voyage, pirates, plagues, or peculiar medieval nap rituals, I'm here. Until then, may your cabbage stay crisp and your dreams gentle.